The Haunted Doll's House by M.R. James Reimagined. The email arrived in Noah's inbox late one evening. It was from a small antiques dealer in the countryside, advertising a collection of unique items for sale. Noah had a passion for collecting rare, eclectic antiques, and his latest obsession was vintage dollhouses. He had been searching for one in particular, something old, intricate, and unmistakably unique. The email contained a photo of a beautiful, handcrafted doll's house. It was Victorian in design, complete with red brick walls, tiny bay windows, and delicate lace curtains. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Even the roof tiles were individually painted. It was the kind of item that collectors like Noah dreamed of finding. A note in the email piqued his curiosity even further. This piece has a mysterious past, rumored to have belonged to a wealthy family whose history is troubled, not for the faint of heart. Noah immediately called the dealer. The transaction was swift, and 2 days later, the doll's house arrived at his home in a large, carefully packed crate. Noah lived alone in a modern townhouse in the city. He cleared space in his study for the doll's house, placing it on a sturdy table beneath a warm desk lamp. As he unpacked it, he marveled at the intricate details: tiny furniture, hand-painted wallpaper, miniature porcelain dishes, and even oil lamps with flickering LED lights. Oddly though, the house didn't come with any dolls, no family figures, no servants. Just the house itself. Still, it was perfect. That evening, Noah spent hours examining every room, opening tiny doors and drawers, and arranging the furniture. By midnight, he was satisfied. He clicked off the desk lamp and went to bed. The first night. At 3:13 a.m., Noah woke up suddenly. A soft creaking sound echoed faintly through the house. At first, he thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but the weather was calm. The noise seemed closer, like floorboards shifting. He got up, groggy but uneasy. As he padded down the hall to his study, he noticed a faint glow coming from the room. He opened the door and froze. The doll's house was lit from within. Warm, golden light glowed through the miniature windows, spilling onto the table. Noah stepped closer, his heart pounding. He hadn't installed any lights in the house. The LED lamps were purely decorative and non-functional. Then he saw movement. Shadows flickered across the tiny windows, as though figures were walking inside. Noah leaned in, peering through the front bay window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside the doll's house, two tiny figures, porcelain dolls, stood in the dining room. He could see them clearly now. A man in a dark suit and a woman in a long, old-fashioned dress. They were frozen in place, as if caught mid-conversation. But Noah was certain they hadn't been there before. He hadn't placed any dolls inside the house. He reached out, hesitated, and then opened the front panel of the house. The figures were gone. The rooms were empty, just as he'd left them. Noah closed the panel and stepped back. Maybe he was overtired. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. He turned off the light, left the study, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The second night. The next evening, Noah was hesitant to return to the study, but curiosity won out. He sat before the doll's house, studying every inch of it in the light of his desk lamp. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He even pulled out a magnifying glass to inspect the rooms more closely. No dolls, no lights, no movement. Satisfied, he left the room and went to watch TV. Hours passed and he forgot about the doll's house, until he heard a loud thud from the study. Noah bolted upright. The sound hadn't been subtle. It was as if something heavy had fallen. He rushed to the study and was greeted by a strange sight. The doll's house's front panel was wide open, though he was certain he had closed it. The tiny dining room table was overturned, and the chairs lay scattered across the floor. The chandelier, a delicate crystal ornament, was swinging slightly as though it had just been disturbed. And then he saw them again. The dolls were back. This time there were 4 of them. The man and woman he'd seen before, along with 2 smaller figures, children. They stood in the upstairs bedroom, perfectly still, but their placement felt deliberate. Noah couldn't shake the sensation that they were staring at him. He stepped closer, his breath shallow. As he reached out to touch one of the dolls, a sudden icy draft swept through the room, extinguishing the desk lamp. The study was plunged into darkness. In the silence, he heard it. Faint whispers, high-pitched, frantic, and overlapping. The sounds seemed to come from inside the doll's house. Noah stumbled backward, his heart racing. He fumbled for the light switch on the wall, but when the room was illuminated again, the whispers stopped. The house was as he'd left it, front panel open, furniture disarrayed, and the dolls in their eerie positions. The truth revealed. The next morning, Noah called the antiques dealer. He demanded to know the history of the doll's house. At first, the dealer was reluctant to say much, but after some pressure, he relented. The house, it seemed, had belonged to the Wexler family, a wealthy Victorian household with a dark past. According to local legend, the entire family had been murdered in their home one night by a disgruntled servant. The house had been demolished years ago, but the doll's house was said to have been modeled after the original building. It was rumored to be cursed, with strange events following anyone who owned it. Noah hung up, his stomach churning. He decided then and there to get rid of the doll's house. That evening, he packed it carefully into its crate and left it on the curb for the garbage truck. The final night. But the doll's house wasn't finished with him. At 3:13 a.m., Noah woke to the sound of creaking floorboards. The noise was louder this time, closer. He sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. Then he saw it. The doll's house was back. It sat on the table in his study, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. The front panel was open, and the dolls were no longer inside. Instead, they were standing at the foot of his bed. Noah's scream echoed into the night, but no one heard it. By morning, his townhouse was empty. The doll's house remained on the table in the study, pristine and ready for its next owner. Chapter 1. The chill of the autumn night wrapped around the German student like a shroud, whispering secrets of the darkened streets of Paris. He walked with a heavy heart, his mind consumed by visions of the woman he had lost, the beautiful but tragic figure whose laughter once filled the air with warmth. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow on the cobblestones, a silent witness to the sorrow that clung to him like an unwelcome specter. As he wandered aimlessly, the memories of her haunted him. He could almost hear her voice, a dulcet melody that echoed through the alleys. The townsfolk had warned him of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, tales of madness and despair that had claimed the souls of many. But he dismissed their fears, believing that love could conquer all, even death. His footsteps led him to a desolate tavern, where the air was thick with the scent of stale ale and forgotten dreams. He pushed open the door, the creak of the hinges a harbinger of the darkness within. The flickering candlelight revealed a handful of patrons, their faces gaunt and haunted, eyes sunken deep into their skulls. They exchanged glances, whispers of pity and fear swirling like smoke around him. "Lost something, eh?" one man muttered, his voice slurred by drink. "Or someone?" The student ignored him, his heart heavy with grief. He ordered a drink, the bitter liquid burning a path down his throat, momentarily numbing the ache in his chest. As he sat alone at the bar, he caught sight of a figure in the corner. A woman cloaked in shadows, her face obscured, but her presence magnetic. She seemed to beckon him with a slight movement, her lips curling into a smile that sent shivers coursing through him. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice like silk against the rough edges of his despair. Compelled, he rose and approached her. The tavern faded away, the raucous laughter and drunken brawls dissolving into a dull roar. She looked up at him, her eyes pools of darkness that seemed to draw him in. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the intensity of her sorrow mirroring his. "I know why you're here," she said, a hint of sadness lacing her words. "You seek the one who was taken from you." He nodded, the lump in his throat growing heavier. "But she is gone, lost to the shadows." "Perhaps not," she replied, her voice dripping with an unsettling sweetness. "What if I told you that I could bring her back?" His heart raced at the thought, hope flaring momentarily before the dread settled back in. "At what cost?" Nothing that you cannot bear, she assured him, her smile widening, revealing teeth that glinted like knives. But you must be willing to embrace the darkness. He hesitated, but the longing to see her again overpowered the fear clawing at his insides. I will do anything. Then follow me, she said, rising from her seat and leading him through the back door of the tavern. The air outside was thick with fog, swirling around them like a living entity. She moved with a grace that was both alluring and terrifying, guiding him down narrow alleys until they reached a secluded courtyard, the moonlight barely penetrating the gloom. In the center of the courtyard stood a stone altar, covered in moss and grime. Candles flickered around it, their flames dancing like restless spirits. The woman turned to him, her expression now serious, her eyes glimmering with an otherworldly light. Place your hands upon the altar, she instructed, her voice low and hypnotic, and speak her name. With trembling hands, he approached the altar, the cold stone sending chills up his spine. Elena, he whispered, the name reverberating in the stillness. The moment the syllables left his lips, a tremor ran through the ground beneath him, a sinister energy pulsing in the air. Now focus on her, the woman urged, her voice a soft caress. Think of all that you shared, the love that transcends even death. He closed his eyes, the memories flooding his mind. Her laughter, her touch, the way she had made the world feel alive. But as he focused, a darkness began to creep into his thoughts, a nagging doubt that clawed at his conscience. Is this truly what I want? He murmured, uncertainty taking root in his heart. The woman stepped closer, her breath cool against his ear. Do not falter. You have come too far to turn back now. Just as he was about to relent, a chilling wind swept through the courtyard, extinguishing the candles in an instant. The atmosphere shifted, the air thickening with malevolence. He opened his eyes, and what he saw sent his blood running cold. Chapter 2. Elena stood before him, but not as he remembered. Her once vibrant skin was now a sickly pallor, her beautiful features twisted in a grotesque semblance of life. Her hair hung in matted clumps, eyes hollow and devoid of warmth. The very essence of her soul seemed to be trapped in a macabre state of limbo. Help me, she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper, a haunting echo that twisted his heart. I'm so cold, so lost. No, he gasped, stepping back in horror. This isn't what I wanted. Love knows no bounds, my dear, the woman behind him crooned, her smile widening, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth. But sometimes it brings forth the darkest of consequences. He turned to confront her, but the world around him warped, the courtyard dissolving into a swirling darkness, the very ground beneath his feet shifting like sand. The shadows writhed, tendrils of darkness reaching out to ensnare him, pulling him closer to the altar. Let her go, he shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. This isn't her. Is it not? The woman taunted, her voice echoing through the void. It is a piece of her soul, a fragment of the love you once shared, but now she belongs to the night. Elena's form flickered, her expression a mixture of pain and longing. Help me, please. Torn between love and terror, the student felt the weight of his choices crashing down upon him. I can't, he cried, his voice raw with anguish. This isn't what love is. The darkness only laughed, a cacophony of despair that reverberated through his very being. The shadows coiled tighter around him, their grip unyielding. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, the chill of death settling over him like a funeral shroud. Join us, the woman hissed, her eyes glinting with sadistic glee. Embrace the darkness. Embrace your love for her. No, I refuse. He fought against the encroaching shadows, desperation fueling his struggle, but they only tightened their hold, dragging him closer to the altar, to the grotesque mockery of the woman he had once adored. Your love was never enough, the woman whispered, her voice dripping with malice. You should have accepted the inevitable. With a final surge of will, he grasped for the remnants of his humanity, his voice rising in defiance. I will not be a part of this. But it was too late. The shadows surged forward, engulfing him in a torrent of darkness. He could feel the fragments of his soul being ripped apart, the love he had clung to twisting into something horrific. He screamed, the sound swallowed by the void. a cacophony of despair that echoed into eternity. Chapter 3. The tavern lay silent, the patrons lost in their own misery, unaware of the tragedy unfolding just outside. The woman stood alone in the courtyard, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she surveyed the remnants of their encounter. The altar was now stained with the essence of the student, a dark offering to the shadows that lingered just beyond the veil of reality. Elena's hollow eyes gazed into the abyss, a silent testament to the darkness that they had both embraced. Another soul claimed, the woman murmured, her voice a sinister lullaby. Another love twisted into the void. As she turned to leave, the shadows whispered around her, a symphony of lost hopes and shattered dreams. The night stretched on, an eternal darkness that swallowed everything in its path, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of despair. In the distance, the moon hung low, a cold observer of the horrors that unfolded beneath its gaze. It illuminated the cobblestones once more, the shadows dancing in a sinister waltz, a reminder that love, in its purest form, could be the most dangerous of all. And in the silence that followed, the world continued on, oblivious to the darkness that lurked just beyond the light, waiting patiently for the next soul to fall. The mist hung low over the barren countryside, clinging to the skeletal trees like a shroud. The only sounds were the rhythmic clatter of hooves on dirt and the creak of the carriage wheels. Dr. Robert Cargrave sat inside, his hands gripping a letter that had arrived weeks earlier, its contents still troubling him deeply. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smudged in places, as if written in great distress. "Come at once. Only you can help. The matter is of life and death." The letter bore the signature of Maud, a woman from his past, someone he had once held dear. That alone was enough to compel him to undertake the long, arduous journey into the remote heart of Central Europe. He had no idea what awaited him, but as the carriage rounded a bend and Castle Sardonicus came into view, an uneasy chill crept up his spine. The castle was a monstrosity of shadow and stone, its jagged spires stabbing upward into the cold moonlit sky. Its windows were dark, like empty eyes staring out into the night. Even the carriage driver, who had been mostly silent during the journey, seemed unnerved. "I'll take you no closer," the driver muttered, his voice trembling. Dr. Cargrave protested, but the driver only shook his head, crossing himself before turning the carriage around. Cargrave had no choice but to walk the final stretch alone. The air grew colder as he approached the towering oak doors of the castle. Before he could knock, they creaked open slowly, as if the castle itself were alive and waiting. Inside, he was greeted by a tall, gaunt manservant whose face was a patchwork of scars. One of his eyes was shut permanently, and his expression was grim. "You are Dr. Cargrave," the man said, his voice low and guttural. "The master has been expecting you. Follow me." The man introduced himself as Krull as he led Cargrave through a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and shadows seemed to dance on the walls as their footsteps echoed. Finally, they entered the grand hall, a cavernous room dominated by a long table and a massive fireplace. Seated at the head of the table was Baron Sardonicus. Cargrave froze at the sight of him. The Baron's face was a grotesque mask, his lips curled upward in a hideous rictus grin that stretched his skin taut. It was not a smile of joy, but one of horror, as though he had been frozen mid-scream. His eyes, however, told a different story. They were filled with torment, pleading for release. "I trust you understand the urgency of my request," the Baron said, his voice hollow and strained. Cargrave nodded, struggling to maintain his composure. "Your condition, it is unlike anything I have ever encountered." Before he could ask further questions, the door opened and a woman entered the room. Cargrave's heart sank as he recognized her. Maud. She was as beautiful as he remembered, though her eyes were heavy with sorrow. She avoided his gaze as she sat down beside the Baron, her posture stiff and formal. Over the next few days, Cargrave began his work. The Baron explained the origins of his condition in a series of tense conversations. Years earlier, Sardonicus had been a different man, a commoner named Merrick. His life had changed the day his father died, leaving him and his mother penniless. Desperate for money, Merrick's mother revealed that the winning ticket for a lucrative lottery had been buried with his father. Driven by greed, Merrick violated the grave, digging up the coffin and prying it open with trembling hands. What he saw inside was never fully explained. Merrick refused to describe it in detail. But the horror of that moment had twisted his face into its permanent grimace. Soon after, he assumed the title of Baron Sardonicus, using his newfound wealth to purchase the castle and isolate himself from the world. But Sardonicus's affliction was not merely physical. His disfigurement seemed to have poisoned his soul. He became a cruel and sadistic man, delighting in the suffering of others. Cargrave witnessed this firsthand during his stay. Sardonicus frequently humiliated Krull, forcing him to perform degrading tasks, and his treatment of Maud was even worse. She stayed silent about the specifics, but her haunted expression spoke volumes. As Cargrave worked on a treatment, he grew increasingly determined not only to cure Sardonicus, but also to free Maud from his clutches. Using his expertise in experimental medicine, he prepared a serum designed to relax the facial muscles and reverse the condition. The night of the treatment arrived. The grand hall was eerily silent as Sardonicus sat in a high-backed chair, his grotesque grin illuminated by the flickering firelight. Cargrave injected the serum carefully, watching as the Baron's expression began to change. Slowly, the muscles in his face relaxed, and the grin faded. For the first time in years, Sardonicus's face appeared almost normal. But the moment of triumph quickly turned to horror. Sardonicus began to scream, a guttural, inhuman sound that echoed through the castle. His face contorted again, this time into an expression of sheer terror. He clawed at his skin, his eyes wild with panic. It's not the serum, Cargrave realized aloud. The horror of his deeds has consumed him. His mind is the true prison. Krull rushed into the room, his deformities making his movements awkward but determined. "You must leave," he hissed at Cargrave. "The Master will not forgive this failure." Cargrave hesitated, but Maud grabbed his arm. "He's right," she whispered. "We have to go now." Together they fled the castle, racing through the dark corridors as Sardonicus's screams grew louder behind them. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening as if the castle itself were alive and angry. Outside, the night air was cold and fresh, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the castle. They climbed into a waiting carriage, Krull's final act of defiance against his master, and sped away into the night. As the castle disappeared into the distance, Cargrave looked back one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the silhouette of Sardonicus standing in a window, his face pressed against the glass, still twisted in its terrible grimace. The following day, news reached them that the castle had collapsed, as if it could no longer bear the weight of its master's sins. Sardonicus was never seen again, and the villagers spoke of the ruins as a cursed place, haunted by the echoes of his screams. Cargrave and Maud parted ways soon after, their reunion bittersweet. Though they had escaped the horrors of Castle Sardonicus, its shadow lingered over them both. For Cargrave, the memory of the Baron's grotesque grin would haunt him forever, a chilling reminder that some wounds could never be healed, and some curses could never be undone.